Tom Krenz, the most innovative museum director in the world, the head of the Guggenheim, and Frank Gehry, my brother.
The last time I did one of these, I followed Robin Williams. And now this juggler guy. Tom, go.
Well, what we'll do today, first of all, is have a little bit of a discussion about the architect-client relationship. But to give you some background on this project, and to do it quickly, we selected a 6-minute video that was recently shown on a British television, Channel 4, I think, which was reporting on the project. And it was a little bit longer than, it was shorter than a documentary, but longer than a soundbite. So it does give you some sense of what the project is about. So why don't we run that video first?
What's being heralded as one of the great buildings of the 20th century is under construction in the unlikely setting of Bilbao in northern Spain. The new Guggenheim Museum takes its name from the foundation set up in America in the late 1930s that support modern and contemporary art. There are 2 such museums in New York and another smaller one in Venice, Italy. The Bilbao Guggenheim has been designed by the American architect Frank Gehry and has been funded entirely by the Basque government. Nicholas Glass has been to Bilbao to find out more about the ambitious project.
As the Spanish acknowledge, this is not the first place on earth, let alone Europe, you'd immediately think to build an extraordinary new museum, industrial provincial Bilbao. Would anyone be bold enough to build something like this in Los Angeles or London, or for that matter Cardiff? The new museum is rising at a bend in the river in Bilbao almost by accident. The Guggenheim had been planning a satellite elsewhere in Europe. If some Basques are unhappy with it, their government did have the will and the money. The museum has taken sleek and angular shape by the water's edge, with its hint of flower petals and its clear nod to Bilbao's past in steel and shipbuilding.
We did not seek the Basque Country out. We did receive a lot of attention because I did speak about Venice, and Venice led to Salzburg, and Salzburg led to Bilbao. Among other side trips that, well, we spent some time in various places looking at this because we were committed to this notion of international, the culture of international activity.
But the Starship Bilbao seems to suit both parties, an iconic building created by a great architect.
When I got here, I realized what was great about it is the toughness of the industrial site. But what saves it is the green valley. And I tried to respond to that. For me, the central idea goes back years to conversations I had with artists over the years about what is a museum for them. And I used to give them all the neutral stuff that architects do. You know, the place should be neutral, the artist first, the art should stand out, and all those things that we all think is our values to make an art. And the artist said, "Hey, Gehry, stop it. We're going to work in our little studios and make these paintings. We really love these little paintings. We want them in the Louvre. We want the building to have a presence in the community. We want it to be strong. We want our little mud pies in great buildings."
The deal between the Guggenheim and the Basque government was signed in 1991. The building is costing about £75 million. They began erecting the steel frame 2 years ago. From a practice in California, Gehry has designed museums before, but nothing quite as dramatic as this. It's a building of curves that couldn't realistically have been attempted without computer technology. Every steel rod mapped out in 3 dimensions. The computer software was developed to assemble French Mirage fighters.
The ideas of movement and fish forms and all that stuff is certainly in my lexicon, but I think that this relates in scale to this site, to the 19th century city, to the river, to the materials.
The materials are glass, Spanish limestone, and most visibly the natural element titanium, normally used for jet fighters. It's strong, malleable, doesn't corrode, glows in the sun, and seems perfect for Gary's style: jagged, jutting, curving, twisting. Everyone we talked to in Bilbao liked the architecture, but in a highly politicized society like the Basque Country, the Guggenheim has become an issue. Critics claim it's draining money from other art projects. It won't do much for Basque culture, so long suppressed, and that the ruling Basque Nationalist Party is making political capital out of it.
Saber que detrás de este proyecto está Guggenheim Nueva York para nosotros es fundamental y por lo tanto apostamos a ciegas por un proyecto de esta categoría y la inversión es lo de menos porque los resultados que vamos a obtener nos van a resarcir de todas estas de estos desembolsos económicos.
With heavy industry in decline, Bilbao is looking to rebuild itself to move into service industries like tourism. A new concert hall is going up. Norman Foster has designed the new metro. The entrances have been nicknamed Fosteritos. The elegant new footbridge is by the Spanish architect Santiago Calatrava. He will design a new airport terminal. The museum, with its tattered Basque flag, is obviously the most spectacular addition to the landscape. It'll cost the Basques £5 million a year to run. For the Americans, the Guggenheim name will get a higher profile and should attract more sponsors and bequests.
We do exhibitions. We build museums. We're committed to expanding our collection. We're committed to culture. Occasionally,
An organisation that was in debt in the early 90s.
well, that's partly what the institution had to work itself through. I mean, if you're going to attract support from the private sector, you're not going to attract support by rolling over and pretending you no longer are alive. You're doing it by basically coming up with an interesting perspective on how culture operates in the world, and being a force for change, and a force for leadership in these kinds of ideas, and it includes Bilbao.
The new Guggenheim is bigger than its New York cousin, the famous spiral designed by Frank Lloyd Wright. Bilbao will have over 100,000 square feet of exhibition space. There'll be 19 galleries. New work has been commissioned from the Italian Francesco Clementi, the American Jeff Koons, and the Basque sculptor Eduardo Chillada.
I have defended always the Guggenheim. I am not, there are lots of people against the Guggenheim here, but not me. I suppose it's going to be very good for the country. I love the things done in front of the unknown, and this has been done in this way, this work.
Crucially, Bilbao will get to see some masterpieces from the Guggenheim's huge modern and contemporary collection. The Basques have set aside £30 million to acquire a collection of their own. The Guggenheim should open next summer. The question is how many people will come, how many from abroad, and will they come more than once? Frank Lloyd Wright referred to his Guggenheim as a wave about to break. Frank Gehry's building is intended to echo that as a great ship of beauty.
You put that first one on.
Can I get the...
Now Frank's going to talk a little bit about the design process and the interaction, but I'll give you first a little background on why this project exists and why it exists where it does. And I think the story here begins probably in the middle 1980s when there was a certain amount of expansion taking place throughout the cultural world in terms of physical facilities. I mean, most museums in the United States had been expanding. There were new additions. And the Guggenheim certainly was not immune to that kind of thinking. But as we look forward into the future, we saw a situation where support, certainly government support for culture, which was a critical ingredient for the ongoing operation of these institutions, was likely to decline, and corporate support seemed flat, and the whole notion of whether or not museums were adequate for the future, even considerations about how they would operate in the 21st century, seemed to be on the table. And one of the options that was open to us, there were two issues, or maybe three issues. We thought that audience was a critical issue, that an institution was able to perpetuate and perhaps increase its audience, it had the likelihood to continue to do programming, which was the second main thing, and that one of the issues that you couldn't avoid simply was scale. There is a function of scale in the operation of large-scale cultural institutions which allows you to reach a wider audience, allows you to do more programming, allows you to generate resources. We felt that the Guggenheim didn't have that scale. One of the advantages that we had, however, was an iconographic building, the Frank Lloyd Wright building, and we also had a small museum in Venice. So we began consciously in the late 1980s to develop this notion that perhaps the Guggenheim should truly become an international institution. And we developed plans to substantially expand our operation in Spain. The idea was that if we had a museum in Spain, that it was the same size as the museum in New York, that there would be a certain dynamic between the two. We wouldn't have to replicate all of the functions in, I meant in Venice. We wouldn't have to replicate all of the functions. We wouldn't have to have storage facilities in Venice. Venice had a large tourist audience. If we had spaces that were equal to the scale of New York, the kind of exhibitions that we organized in New York could also take place in Venice, and there was an economy of scale. That idea began to attract a certain amount of attention, and one of the unintended consequences was that it attracted attention from other cities. We were approached in 1988 by the government of Austria to do a collaboration in the city of Salzburg, which, for lots of reasons that would take too long to explain, and we spent 4 years on it, but the project didn't go forward. But it was also something that in Europe that generated a lot of attention, and we received, beginning in early 1991, some attention and even pressure from people in Spain, first to consider a museum project in Madrid, and then this project in Bilbao. I have to say that my response to Bilbao in the beginning was almost entirely negative. I'd never been there, but I knew that it was in the Basque Country. I knew that what its association was. As Frank said, it seemed tourism, or terrorism, not tourism, terrorism, and High were the two associations that came first to mind. And when a delegation came to us and said that they wanted us to consider a project, I said I just couldn't see the fit, and it just wasn't right. And whether my perceptions were right or wrong, that those were perceptions that were out there, and it just didn't seem to be a fit for the Guggenheim. And this was an interesting situation because they then said, well, of course you're wrong about your perceptions of the Basque Country, but put that aside. What would it take to build a museum? I said, quite simply, and almost in the same way I'm describing it now, we'd been through this process of planning in Venice and in Austria. So I said, well, you'd have to build an iconographic building, using the Guggenheim in New York as a point of departure. Think in terms of the Sydney Opera House, or think in terms of Centre Pompidou in Paris. Think in terms of world-class architecture. My guess is that it would cost about $150 million to build, and that couldn't be our responsibility. You wanted us to operate it in the Basque Country. I had no idea what the audience would be, so we would need guarantees that the government would support its annual operation and guarantee a break-even. We would use our collection, of course, predominantly, but since it would be a modern and contemporary museum, we needed another $50 million for acquisitions and a few other things. But we also said that we would have to play the major role in selecting the architect, and perhaps most importantly, we would select the site. And they more or less agreed to all of that. And quite quickly, I went to the Basque Country for the first time on the 9th of April, 1991, and we began the architectural competition at the end of June, 1991. We signed our first agreement in May, and the competition was an interesting competition. We stipulated the terms in the beginning. We said we would invite 3 architects, 1 American, 1 European, and 1 Asian, that the architects would be given 2 weeks and $10,000 and 1 site visit, and that the Basques could choose the winner from the 3 architectural presentations. And Frank won that competition. It was decided, I think, in early July, and we began to... Pardon? The other 2 architects were Arata Isazaki and a group from Vienna called Co-op Himmelblau. And it was an interesting way to approach a competition because it was almost an impression, it was almost a sketch. But Frank won the competition, and we launched the process. The last thing that I'll say, however, before letting Frank describe the architectural process, the design process, was that our approach to this also had a lot to do with some deep thinking about what function art museums have performed historically. And we began to evolve the notion that they were fundamentally obsolete institutions. We saw that they were predicated on an 18th century idea, the idea of the encyclopedia, where you try to collect sort of one of everything. Even if you have a narrow focus like the 20th century, still there is always this talk about filling gaps in the collection. And that's fundamentally a notion for an institution that is the center of a region where people don't travel, and that it serves a kind of global educational function for that region, but it's certainly not a consistent model for lots and lots of reasons for the world that we live in now. But we saw it as an 18th century idea in a 19th century box. The box was the extended palace, an extended collection of rooms that more or less fulfills its structural destiny sometime in the middle of the 20th century. And what do we mean by that? It could perhaps best be demonstrated or explained by what some of the large institutions do with their quote-unquote collections. I mean, the Guggenheim is by far not the biggest museum in the United States, and we're only 60 years old. But by and large, we store 98% of our collection at any one time in warehouses in Manhattan. And the institutions that exist, in fact, are fairly small and not really prepared to deal with much of the recent large-scale art of the last 30 years, but also not really prepared to deal with a whole future with respect to art making that includes many things that are the subject of this conference this weekend. Museums aren't prepared to deal with technology. They really aren't prepared to deal with performance. So we thought that there were lots of things about culture that were vital to the future of the institution, that were essential to accommodate in a new building design. This notion of a museum for the 21st century was something that was pretty much behind what we were doing. But the 2 central issues, I think, if you break them down, can perhaps next be seen in 2 more slides that we have, is that we'd evolved a model, a more or less international model for the Guggenheim, is that we expanded our facilities in New York, uptown. We are developing with Arata Isazaki, a Guggenheim Museum Soho. We sought to acquire a very prominent building in Venice, which it looks like we'll get at the end of the Grand Canal, to develop our position in Venice, and we're building this museum in Bilbao. And in addition, we've made an alliance with the Samsung Foundation and Samsung Electronics to be a partner in their new museum in Seoul that is designed by guess who. And we're going to have a small...
There it is, right there.
Yeah. Frank Gehry's museum in Seoul opens in the year 2001. And we have a small presence. We will have a small presence as of September in Berlin, and we're actually even talking about Paris. And we want to connect all of this stuff with a whole sort of internet technology. But the international piece is one thing that's very important. But the other thing to understand about this museum that you've just seen that Frank's going to talk about is its scale. I mean, this is a scale drawing of the Guggenheim in Bilbao, which is on the top left. That's the Metropolitan Museum just below it in New York City. To the right is the Sydney Opera House, and to the far bottom right-hand corner is the Guggenheim in New York. I mean, what's uncommon about this museum in Bilbao is its overwhelming physical presence. I mean, it has a sort of a visceral hold on you the moment that you step into it. And beyond that, it's been designed for practically everything that doesn't exist in other museums. I can't describe all of that, but it sort of sets up the situation that the master of putting all of this together is sitting here on my left, and he'll talk a little bit about the process.
It's a little hard to talk about buildings that are not quite finished, but my wife reminded me that we're in that kind of time where people get sonograms of their
upcoming baby, so I guess it's all right. Tom and I had, well, first of all, Richard's introduction about the client, the program, and the architect, so he gets 2/3 of the thing, right? And I can aw shucks the rest. Tom and I had a bit of a history in North Adams. We'd gotten to work together on a big industrial complex that he dogged through and is really making happen over the years. I don't know how he does it, but where we had huge spaces, huge galleries, a lot of discussions with artists, a lot of discussions with collectors like Count Panza. And so I was on the wavelength with him by the time I got started. Nope, doesn't work. Oh.
You went past one slide.
Okay, I'm sorry, it doesn't show on there. This was my first sketch done done almost within days of seeing the site. And when you look at the building, it kind of looks like it there, and I wonder why it took so long from here. I mean, if I could figure out how to go directly, we could make some money. This was the competition model done in 2 to 3 weeks. And this is the computer made model of the final design. I work in several scales at once because I focus on the final building. That's hard to do. You get enamored with the product, you get enamored with the models, with the images, and they're nothing. They're just part of the process. If you want the image that you had in your head to come through to the end, you have to develop a process that focuses on the end and not get derailed by stuff along the way that looks pretty. So we work in a lot of different scales, which keeps jogging me back and forth into reality. It's like a tailor shop when you get going. Each one of those shapes on the wall, each piece, is a part of the building that's been studied, restudied. It's like watching paint dry to watch us work. We'll move a piece of cardboard 1/16 of an inch and look at it for 2 weeks and then say, yeah, I guess that's right, and then we'll put it in the, and those little photographs on them are the trail. We keep a trail of where we were because inevitably you go too far and you want to say, well, 2 weeks ago it was great, what happened? And we pull ourselves back to that. Now Tom is involved on a weekly basis in this process. He comes to visit. He's a quick read. He understands where we're going and does have input, does say, I don't like that shape. I don't want that bill. I don't want you to waste part of my budget on a thing that I don't need. And it's this kind of back and forth through that process without stopping the creative process. He was able to keep a dialogue with me without derailing me, so to speak. This gadget, which some of you probably know about, is what we took the shapes off the model into the computer with. And from that, we were able to develop shop drawings of each piece of steel so that each piece was represented and the contractors could, with assurance, bid on the project. The steel fabricators, 6 of them, bid through the computer documentation, came in 18% under budget, and there were 6 of them. They were within a point of each other. So we were able, with this technology, to absolutely define so that there was no risk taken by the contractor. As it was being built, only two small pieces of steel about this long. When it all came together, there was a creep of dimensional creep, and it resulted in two small pieces of steel having to be remade. Part of the building is on the river, so it looks like a boat, and part of the building is rectilinear and to the city, the 19th century city. My fantasy is as you enter, there's a glass pavilion, that there would be a picture or a holograph of Frank Lloyd Wright looking down, disgusted at all of us.
Can you go back to that one? Go back one.
Go back.
Yeah, just a note about this. An interesting feature of this project is this bridge that actually cuts through the museum. And you can't really see it on the right because it just cuts off in the slide and it's still under construction. But there's a tower about 215 feet high, which sort of pulls this large gallery under the bridge, and then the tower comes up and towers over the bridge. It was partly this site. The thing about this site is that Bilbao's on the Atlantic, and it's also a seaport. In fact, the port of Bilbao is the second largest in Europe after Rotterdam in size now, but the original port, the 19th century port, actually is on the site where the museum is. So when it came down to this question of selecting site, they had not considered this as a location. They were actually promoting a square city block in the middle of the city, and Bilbao is about a city of about 1 million people. We didn't like that site at all, and picked this site because it was the collision of this bridge, which sort of dominates the city. It's quite high off the water, so that ocean-going boats could go under the bridge, but it also is on the site of the original port. And I think Frank's response to that with the shapes, I mean, as he referred to the boat shape of the gallery, one of the successes, I think the great successes of this building from its exterior design is its equation with the city. It is both at the same time radically different from the city, but it radically embraces the city in its design and its shape. You can see again in this slide the bridge, which is just on the lower left, and then the tower, just the skeleton of the tower rising behind it. That's so far away, but that skeleton of the tower is actually much larger than the mass that you see in the front. But this site, I think, had a lot to do with inspiring the kind of architectural response that Frank was able to develop.
You're asking an artist to do the bridge. We're not going to have time to do the other things, but...
Well, we have this, I mean, one of the pieces with the bridge is that we talked about how can you also bring art to the outside of this, because the building is so overwhelming. I mean, Richard Serra, for all his scale, looks almost inconsequential. On the outside, you could never put the largest Richard Serra sculpture, simply wouldn't work outside the building. So one of the things that we've done is that we've offered the bridge as a work of art to a French artist, Daniel Buren, who's going to do something with it. We're going to do some projections on the outside of the building with Jenny Holzer. There's actually an Yves Klein fire piece from the 1950s that we're going to install also on the outside of this. But the architecture is so powerful that many conventional forms of sculpture just wouldn't work with it, so we haven't even tried to do anything with that.
The exterior skin is titanium. It's 1/3 of a millimeter thick. It is like a foil, and it will move in the wind. Tom doesn't believe this is going to happen, but when the wind hits the building, it's going to flutter a bit. It took a year to get the titanium right. So if anybody decides to use titanium, call me first, because we had a sample that showed how beautiful it was in the light and how beautiful it was, period. And when we ordered the first sheets of titanium, it came out looking like dull, dumb stuff, metal, dumb metal. Didn't look nice at all. We had to go to the factory, and it was like mixing a salad. We had to put a little oil on the thing and a little paprika stuff here and there, you know, and slowly watch this thing go through the rollers and eventually got to the surface that we wanted it, because it's very subtle in the way it reflects light. And what you see are some dark spots that you put the two pieces of metal side by side, they look identical, but by the location on the building, catch the light slightly differently. And it's something we didn't anticipate, and but we're going to live with it. This is the inside gallery, which is, Tom had the notion of a 430-foot long Dan Flavin piece that he wanted to show somewhere, and so we made a gallery that's 450 feet long.
Actually, this gallery is unusual. There are 19 galleries in the museum. This is a little over 30,000 square feet. Another interesting feature of this particular space is that it's also on grade, so that you can drive a tractor-trailer truck into it. We've allowed for that. Being on grade means that there's no weight restrictions. So a lot of the things that you run up against in conventional museums, which are in conventional museums, it goes back to this notion of the museum as a box, as a 19th century extended palace, have been overcome here. We've also built adjacent to all of the exhibition spaces, integrated into the architecture, fairly large-scale support areas and storage areas, so that works that are in here can be easily deinstalled, new works can be brought in, and the museum has a kind of efficiency that is rare and even unusual for any other institutions that I know about.
The issue of context is something Tom and I sort of found out we shared. I had an experience 15 years ago. I went to Vienna and was taken to the Kunsthistorisch and saw the 4 Bruegel paintings in a classical gallery with fabric on the walls and skylight. And I walked in the room and fell to my knees. The Bruegels I'd seen in photographs but never real. I just overwhelmed me. That image hung with me. I mean, I just lived on it. 3 years later, I went back to Vienna and I asked if I could see the Bruegels again. Oh, sure you can. They're in another room because the galleries are being remodeled. I was taken into a small room that had a 9-foot high ceiling. It was about a 20 by 20 room, and the Bruegels looked like about this big and terribly disappointing compared to the other image. Of course, 15 or 20 minutes later, I got into the paintings and it didn't matter. But it's that 15 or 20 minutes. When you go to a museum, why not have the context? Why not have the experience enhance and help? That's it.
Are we out of time?
Yeah. There's one other issue, just one more issue. This was in the competition, the atrium, and I saw it as a kind of a quarry that you could hang art in. And Tom chewed me out. He said, "I want something." Tell him what you wanted. Anyway, this is what he got.
We wanted a space that was in the museum that, I mean, the museum's a creature of its architecture. The building's a creature of its architecture to a certain extent. But in this atrium space in particular, Frank had this notion of making it, originally making it a place where you could hang art in it, because it was an art museum after all. And we took the opposite position. This should be the cathedral, the center, the spinal cord of the museum. So this atrium is actually 60 meters high. It's a 17-story building on the inside. And he pushed it in. We developed an image. I mean, one day I came out to L.A. and he had a book of sculpture from of plaster casts from Brancusi's studio. So the Brancusis became a dominant image. I mean, you have these big curving, curvilinear white shapes that actually house functions like stairways and elevators and things like that inside this atrium. Also, there was another image, a dominant image was Fritz Lang's Metropolis. Because you'll see that as you go around, the idea of keeping the atrium as a spinal cord of the museum, it still is a path of circulation around it on 3 floors of exhibition space. So this image work of thinking about an image like Metropolis, thinking an image like Brancusi's studio, marrying them together, thinking of a Gothic cathedral, pressing the space together but letting it soar. It's one of the great interior spaces, and you can certainly see it now because the building's about 6 weeks from completion. It'll be finished at the end of March and or early April.
Like the sonogram, when we see the final thing, it's going to be a shock. I hope it works. The nice thing is that we're still friends and we've gone through this process. Thank you very much.